Welcome to a seminar, spring semester 2017. But I do want to just make sure that you know a little bit about Henri. Dr. Manasse he's got his PhD from University of Minnesota. He was on faculty in our department. I won't say the years, but for, what is it, like 10 years or so? 25 years. Whoa. It was a long time ago. And then he was dean of the College of Pharmacy. So he's very well known and respected here. He went on both within the university, moved up and was, I don't know the exact title, but it's like Vice Chancellor for Health Services interim, and then went to the University of Iowa and did that same kind of position there. And most recently he was Executive Director of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. And he's known throughout the United States, but also throughout the world. He's very active in the International Federation of Pharmacy, both when he was at SHP and currently. He speaks all over the place. I'm sure you've seen him updates, you know, almost every week he's giving a lecture in Argentina or somewhere. His passion is international pharmaceutical education. So recently he spent a month in Sydney, Australia. I tried to talk him into getting me to come along somehow, like I would carry his book bag or something. But that didn't work out for me. But it worked out great for him. So he's going to talk about his experience there, what he knows about pharmacy education in Australia, and probably lots of other things.
Yay. Right before you begin, I want to say, especially to the grad students, but also to my colleagues on this side, if it was not for Dr. Henri Manasse, I would not be here with you. He was the dean who insisted I'd be hired. Thank him now.
That goes both ways, right? Well, thanks, Glenn, for a very nice introduction. I never could explain to my mother what I did. But before I get started, and I'm also a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and I just got an email that a report has been released, and it's something that some of you may be interested in, called The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, the Current State of Evidence and Recommendations for Research. So,
I'm in love with that stuff.
Okay.
And
Well, you know, there's going to be, I think, some interesting policy challenges coming to the profession of pharmacy as more of both medicinal and recreational use of marijuana is legalized. And there are some countries, actually, where pharmacy has been required by their legislature to be the dispensing port for marijuana, both for recreational and medicinal use. So this will come to the U.S. as well. But if anybody's interested in that, you can go on the Academy of Medicine website and get this report. Well, I think it's timely, actually, that we talk a bit about pharmacy education and practice. You guys are in school all day, but in my retirement, I've had the privilege of watching a lot of the interviewing that's going on of the cabinet positions, and I was particularly interested in the education department, and then, of course, yesterday with Dr. Price for the Department of Health. And one of the things that you pick up very quickly is there's an articulation of a social philosophy that's embedded in this Trump administration that's going to be gathering around this cabinet table that I would say is about 180 degrees different than Australia. And we'll talk about that as I go through the presentation. I served for, as Glenn mentioned, for a month as a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. It's a university very similar to UIC, right in the middle of Sydney, and attracts a very diverse population of students. It has lots of programs. I would say in addition to what we have, they also have a law school, but the students live in the community as they do for this university, and it's a very vibrant place. It's actually right there. This is the main administration building, and this some of the school buildings. And this particular building is the building where my office was. That's the Graduate School for Health. And then, of course, you've all seen the iconic Opera House in the harbor of Sydney. It's just a beautiful, beautiful city. If it wasn't so far away, I would give serious consideration to moving to Australia. Some of you may have read some of Dr. Ben Remo's work. Charlie serves as the Dean of the Graduate School of Health. In addition to pharmacy, there are 7 other disciplines. One which is kind of interesting, it's an ophthalmic technician. I don't think we have a similar kind of a job. They can do portions of what optometrists do, and they can do portions of what ophthalmologists do, and a portion of what opticians do. And they call it optotics. And they have clinical psychology, which also you typically don't see in health professions graduate programs. But in any case, Charlie's major focus of research for all of his career has been studying the impact of community pharmacy on various patient care outcomes. And again, those of you who follow the international literature on this question, you'll probably run across his name. He's a very dynamic guy. He's from Gibraltar originally. He was born in Gibraltar. Gibraltar, sits right on the southern border of Spain, so he's fluent in Spanish. And actually, he and I met at a conference some years ago in South America, and I was very impressed. He gave his lecture in Spanish. My primary focus was on experiential education and partnering with hospital pharmacy departments. And this was rather interesting because I started my career in pharmacy education in 1968, working for this school, studying the whole issue of experiential education and moving away from this apprenticeship model that existed at that time and bringing experiential education into the college and structuring it and having preceptor training and evaluation of performance of students and all these kinds of things was sort of unheard of at that time. But this is just beginning to be an issue in Australia. And the other part of what they were interested in having me look at was developing a relationship between the university and hospitals. And unlike, for example, a school like this that has literally hundreds of partnerships all over the state of Illinois, includes virtually all the hospitals, I think, in the state, more than likely, which, 200 hospitals or so in Illinois. And we actually have some affiliation agreements with places outside of the state of Illinois. Well, this is just beginning to be on the radar screen in Australia, and as I describe the educational programs in Australia, you'll get a sense of why that is. So I had an opportunity, this was terrific. I had no responsibilities whatsoever. I stayed in one of these executive hotels across the street from the university, so I'd walk over every day. And I spent a lot of time meeting with people. And as I point out, key professional and educational leaders. So one of the guys that I met with was the guy who negotiates the contract between community pharmacy and the government. And I'll talk about that in more detail. Had lots of interesting discussions with hospital administrators and some of the government policy people. Also had an opportunity to review a lot of their policy documents. There's an interesting cultural characteristic of Australians. They prepare beautiful documents, very thorough, well covered, but there's a big gap between what they say in their documents and what actually is occurring in real life. And actually Charlie admitted that to me. He says, one of the things you're going to have to get used to, you're an American looking at us. And he said, we do a lot of talking, but we don't do a lot of doing. And we sort of jump into things without really thinking things through. And there's usually a long tail, but the tail never ends. So it's an interesting cultural characteristic because if you look at us as Americans, particularly those of us who have been in administration, you better get your plans well articulated and you better be able to show that you've got some evidence that you've actually accomplished things. And we're very much metrics oriented around performance. That's not a big issue in Australia, which probably adds to their quality of life. They're very relaxed. They're just fun people to be with. I say that sort of generically, and in fact, I was just talking, and I think you found the same thing, right? People are extremely friendly, hospitable, and nothing bugs them too much. And then I had an opportunity to present lectures to the master's students and the PhD students, and then the Australian Society of Hospital Pharmacists asked me to do a webinar, and they asked me to share some of my thoughts about the future of hospital practice and what the Australians need to be thinking about from a more global perspective. Well, let's put this in context. How many people live in the United States? What's the Census Department saying these days? 318? Yeah. 318 million. The land mass of Australia is about equivalent to that of the United States. So if you take Australia and put it on the United States, it'd be about the same, pretty close. So we have 315 million living on this land mass. They have that same land mass with 24 million people. 80% of their population lives along the eastern shore. So if you think about the very northern part of the east side of Australia, that's Queensland, that's their province, Queensland. Brisbane is the well-known city there. Then you come south into New South Wales, which is where Sydney is. And then if you come a little bit west, the next big city is Melbourne. And in the middle between Melbourne and Sydney is Canberra, which was a city designed by a Chicago architect to house the government. So that's just a government city. It's a very beautiful city, very boring because there's nothing there other than government buildings. Not a lot to do, but some nice restaurants. But in any case, it is just amazing to me. While Sydney has crowds, as soon as you get out of Sydney, it's desolate. It's pretty desolate. And in fact, I have a former president of ASHP, Cindy Brennan, and her husband are in the process of sailing around the world. And they had to do some repair on their sailboat, and they have spent the last 8 months just in the outback of Australia, which is the big centerpiece, which is hugely desert and very, very wild, untamed country. They have a parliamentary form of government with a house. It's a little bit different than the British Parliament structure, but they have a House and a Senate. But the key component of that Parliament is the House, and it's the House who selects their premier, and what the House decides kind of goes in the structure of their Parliament. Their political philosophy and values, again, couldn't be any different than those of the United States, and particularly as I listen to Trump, as I listen to these candidates that he's bringing into the cabinet, as you listen to sort of social philosophy from these individuals, these folks are not only conservative in the political sense, but have a different point of view than what I call an egalitarian ideal. People in Australia believe that the government has to play a very critical role in virtually all aspects of life, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's transportation. And as Australian citizens, you pay huge taxes, about 60%. But it doesn't bother them because you know what? I never saw a pothole in all the time I was in Sydney. Their highways, I was there in a previous time, my wife and I spent 2 weeks driving in much of eastern Australia, and their highways are incredibly fabulous. They have good signage, they have good lighting, and again, if you structure government in such a way that people are positive about it, obviously they develop a philosophy that, the government's pretty important. We, on the other hand, as Americans, in fact, Thomas Jefferson even said, the best government is no government, right? And this antagonism toward the role of government in our life in the United States has been an issue since our founding. So this was a wonderful experience, being able to live there essentially for a month and observe it, listen to the television debates on various issues. Very, very different country. Lots of public and private partnerships. So for example, the airport in the city, which is gorgeous, is totally run privately on behalf of the government. And there's been a big push in the last 10 years to privatize virtually, major functions that government had done previously. However, the difference between their privatization and oftentimes our privatization, there are very strict standards for performance, and they punish very hard if you screw up and don't follow what the standards are. Sometimes my discussions, I have a son who's real interested in politics, and if you look again at the history of the United States, we are a nation of hucksters. We really are. Everybody's out to make a buck, and sometimes legitimately and sometimes illegitimately. And I don't know if you're following this, but virtually every day there is a report of a pharmaceutical manufacturer being fined hundreds of millions of dollars for violating Medicaid purchasing laws or rebate stuff, all this kind of stuff. Yesterday, Mallinckrodt, $100 million fined by the Justice Department. And I don't want to go so far as to say, this is the perfect world, but perhaps when you only have 24 million people, you can kind of corral people a little bit better than you can when you've got 315 million, largely, stimulated by an economy that's highly reliant on private enterprise. Life is pretty good, I think, for Australians. They get free healthcare services. They get free education all the way from primary school through university studies. There's lots of disability support for individuals and families. So the kinds of issues that a lot of our disabled population faces are not the issues that they have to deal with in Australia. So you might say, boy, that's pretty good. And then they do have a strong can-do, and as I put here, a just-do-it mentality and spirit. And as I said, they're quick to jump in to begin to do something. And I'm going to give a couple examples later on. We talk about what's going on in pharmacy. And, Lord knows where they might end up with it, but nonetheless, just do it. On the other hand, sometimes it's like going back to the 50s, a little bit old-fashioned. And I didn't have time to visit Tasmania, but apparently Tasmania, which is an island, one of the provinces island off of the southern coast of eastern Australia, is even 50s all the way across the board. Everybody who I talked to said, if you go to Tasmania, you have to be sort of in the mindset of Pleasantville. Remember that movie? So let's talk a little bit about pharmacy education in Australia. There's about 25,000 registered pharmacists. And if you'd like, we can diverge a little bit on this term registered. I hate that term. It's a term that derives from British law back in the 1850s, and it's essentially meaning that if you meet the qualification, we're going to put your name in a register, okay, a log book. Well, that's the way things were done in the 1840s, 1850s. But the term transferred to the United States, and we use it as well. If you think about what it takes for you to be a pharmacist, say in the state of Illinois, you have to complete education, you have to be of good moral character, you have to take an examination. So you have to meet a series of qualifications, which then, if you meet the qualifications, the state issues you a license, right? Gives you an authority to do something. A licensure legally is very different than registration. And we've kind of confused the terms in the U.S. I personally would like the profession to sort of grab a hold of this and get this resolved and get rid of this registered stuff and call us licensed pharmacists, or like my wife is a registered nurse, it says licensed professional nurse is what her license says. And we should probably just use the Doctor of Pharmacy title, just like physicians use Doctor of Medicine on their licenses. Anyway, Their educational system is, of course, modeled after educational credentialing system of the United Kingdom. And one of the things that I observed is that there are many, many words that are used in the educational parlance that have a very different meaning than what we ascribe to those same words. And if you've done any work in the United Kingdom, you have to literally have a dictionary, because there are many words that are used in British English that we don't use, and then some words that they use that has a different meaning in American English. So one of those is accreditation, and we'll get off into that. The minimum requirement is a BS degree in pharmacy, a 4-year degree. We abandoned that in 1958 in the United States. So it gives you a little bit of a comparison. And they also offer a master's in pharmacy. Again, this is the British model, was the British system way of dealing with some attempt to compare the combination of BS and MS to the PharmD. That's sort of the politics behind this. But in the British system, they don't have a professional doctoral degree. So in American higher education, we have all kinds of professional doctoral degrees, right? There's the Doctor of Education, the Doctor of Optometry, the Doctor of Podiatry, Doctor of Business. Nursing has started a degree, a Doctor of Nursing. But that kind of a credential doesn't exist in the British system. And in fact, physicians, when they graduate, they get the Bachelor of Medicine, and they're not called doctor until they finish their specialties, and they're designated as consultants. So again, a very different system. At the University of Technology Science where I was, you can enter the master's degree program in pharmacy, a 2-year program, without any background in pharmacy. So if you qualify for admission with a background in anthropology, for example, you could spend 2 years studying pharmacy and get a master's degree in pharmacy. And then on top of that, you have to do you'll see down here, I use this pre-registration, we'll get back to that, do a internship, and then take the licensure examination. So again, if you do a compare and contrast, it's quite a different system. And the outcomes, in my view, are also very, very different, because when we get to talking about hospital pharmacy, it's really underdeveloped in Australia. There are 19 schools of pharmacy that are accredited. Standards have been developed for the educational program. There is this body that does accreditation. And it's interesting, as part of British social philosophy, and this goes back a long ways and it still exists, they're sort of the creators of the caste system. And they require examinations, for example, when you finish high school, to make a determination about what directions you can go in higher education. So you have the ordinary examinations, which all the students basically take, and the advanced examinations, which really good students can take. And they're also the folks who came up with the measurement of intelligence traits. And part of the driver for moving into that area of science was to objectively be able to establish a caste system, if you look at the history of measurement. In any case, they've also developed this National Competency Standards Framework for pharmacists. It's a big document and fairly comprehensive, but there's, I think, a big gap between what's said and what's actually taught in the curriculum. They require, from the time that you graduate with either the bachelor's after 4 years or the master's after 2 years, what they call pre-registration. And again, registration is the terminal, the end point of all of your education and capacity to be able to work as a pharmacist, right? Because they use that term, registration. So pre-registration means the experience that you gain that's structured, partially structured, before you sit for the licensing exam. And from a quantitative point of view, that's 1 year. you have to work in a pharmacy. The preceptors have to be approved. You have to have about half of the year is structured. And there are a couple of organizations, Monash University, the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia, and the Guild of Community Pharmacists, who offer these structures for the internship. So as a student, you have to pay, I think it's 2,000 Australian dollars, and you get all this material. A lot of it's online, and you follow it in the course of your experiential development in the pharmacy. And then again, when you're all done, you take a licensure examination, and then that leads to having your name put on that book, famous book. They also have technician training. It's sort of mixed in terms of its requirements, but both the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia and the Pharmacy Guild for $2,000 offer a training program for pharmacy technicians.
Most of the faculty in the colleges are pharmacy, PhD, and master's training?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the University of Technology of Sydney Master of Pharmacy. And just to give you a little bit of history, Dr. Ben Rameau was on the faculty at the University of Sydney for many, many years, 20-some years. And prior to that, he was on the faculty at the University of Brisbane in Queensland. And the more that he has done research in pharmacy practice and has looked at the skill base that he believes pharmacists need, the more dissatisfied he became with the offerings at the University of Sydney. And the University of Sydney, I would say, is kind of the gold standard of higher education in Australia. He said, what we really need is a program that focuses on the services of the pharmacist. The services of the pharmacist. Now, again, philosophically, it's quite different than we do here. And some of you who have been on the Educational Policy Committee, for example, and you've debated what's the purpose of this curriculum, what's your end point? Well, he said we need a curriculum that focuses on the services that pharmacists need to offer to patients. And why is this important? And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The Australian government contracts with the approximately 5,500 community pharmacies in Australia to provide pharmacy services. And they've been moving away from dispensing fees and product markups to services reimbursement. And Dr. Ben Rameau is smart enough to know that both scope of service, intensity of service, and impact of those services are going to drive the credibility of the profession in negotiating this with the government. This is, again, when you have a social system, as I've described, like this, you've got to be always thinking about how do you position yourself in negotiations with the government for what you want to get paid for. So they have, over the course of these 2 years, they have developed these 5 subject streams, which is based on the professional services agreement that the pharmacies have with the government. And they've divided it into these areas. So one they call big picture, sort of an introduction to evidence-based practice, and they look at this concept of molecule to market. So, those of you who've been educated in pharmacy know, you sort of start with drug discovery, and then you go through dosage form development and clinical testing and clinical impacts, marketing, and, that whole scenario. Pharmaceutical sciences, and it's substantially reduced, contrasted to the American curriculum. Therapeutics, they have 3 courses in integrated therapeutics, and this is taught from a case study point of view. 4 courses that focus on professional services, and these also include law and primary care. And then clinical practice, which is sort of the first introduction of students to clinical practice in experiential sites. Some of these are community-based sites, some of them are hospitals, but again, very limited. And then you can go for an additional year, do an international project, and participate in some international location. and you can then get the Master of Pharmacy International. Now, why is this important? Well, Australia is 14 hours flying southwest from California. And if you kind of think about where they are, they're closer to Antarctica than they are to us. They're really isolated. And there's a huge, huge effort on the part of the government through the universities and also in the workplace to get people connected outside of the country, to help with innovation, to help people understand the bigger international context. And one of the reasons I was able to get the grant to spend a month there is they want foreigners to come there as well as their own faculty to leave and, to go elsewhere. So the intention here is, let's not be sort of narrowly focused on pharmacy the way we sort of see it every day in Australia. Let's get some people going to other countries and seeing how things are done, and then hopefully bringing back some new innovations or some new ideas. And then they can do electives, and they also have to do a research project. Well, you can imagine if you don't have a 4-year degree in pharmacy and you just come in for this program, and then you expect to go into clinical practice, that's a big question mark, right? So I had a lot of discussions with Dr. Ben-Ramo about this. Well, let's talk a little bit about pharmacy practice. As I said, I visited several hospitals, and I'll just describe one service in a pediatric hospital. And for those of you who work in hospital pharmacy, see what you think of this. This is a 24-bed pediatric intensive care unit. All the drugs basically are in ward stock. So they had a cabinet probably 4 times as big as this wall separator. So, out to here. And from floor to ceiling, virtually all the drugs that would be used on this floor. And everywhere I went in that pediatric intensive care unit, I saw bottles of concentrated potassium chloride. And it so happened that I was introduced to the medical director of the unit. And, we did our usual nice introductions, and he said, well, what do you think? I said, you have got a huge accident waiting to happen here. Sort of looked at me, and I said, we have outlawed, basically, potassium chloride, concentrated potassium chloride in all units in hospitals. In fact, you would probably lose your accreditation anymore if they find it on the floor, right? We have eliminated ward stock in the main. Okay, and we've gone to unit dose, we've gone to electronic cabinets, and all kinds of mechanisms whereby we assure safety of the products and integrity of the products, but also verification and, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, we actually are beginning to look at electronic cabinets. I said, well, you better hurry, because this is unacceptable. And, in a modern pediatric hospital, in a relatively modern country, again, it takes me back to when I was starting pharmacy back in the early 60s. And as you might imagine, in a government-run country, public hospitals are the predominant model. They are starting to get some private hospitals. And this is interesting because this is happening in other parts of the world. Mexico, for example. Spain, the Joint Commission is now accrediting private hospitals. Thailand, a number of countries where the movement to private hospitals to compete with government hospitals and having standards for those hospitals accredited by an American set of standards that have been internationalized a little bit is driving an immense pressure on pharmacy, because the international standards have standards for pharmacy quite similar to the ones that are required in the United States. So all of a sudden, what do you have? You have a workforce problem. You don't have a sufficient number of people who have the skills to be able to implement these projects. They, like most government hospitals around the world, very low staffing levels, very similar to Europe and other parts of the world. Some of you may know Jacqueline Sarouge, who was the president of the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists for a number of years. She works in a 2,000-bed hospital and has 3 pharmacists. And I asked her one time, I said, is that dangerous? And she said, absolutely, absolutely. But this is not uncommon. In fact, our pharmacists don't really know how well they have it. Even our government hospitals are fairly well staffed in pharmacy, and actually kind of almost the hotbed of innovation. Some clinical services are evolving. So in a 900-bed public hospital that I was in, I actually went on rounds with a Australian who was educated in the United States and did a residency at Sloan Kettering, and he's part of a team of stem cell transplant physicians, and he's board certified in oncology in the United States. So in that sense, they had to send somebody out and import them and have them there. So workforce development is a challenge all the way from technicians through clinical specialists. And I've just given you a couple of pictures here. This happens to be the Prince Albert Hospital in Sydney, hospital that was built in the 1840s, and they've done a fabulous job of renovating it and keeping the old exterior and redoing the insides, kind of what they need to do at County Hospital. But you can see community pharmacies, they're not that different from, our chain drugstore pharmacies. And chains are just beginning to come in, and that's another issue I won't get into today. Well, as I said, much of pharmacy practice is being defined by now called the 6th Community Pharmacy Agreement. So this is a 5-year contract that pharmacy has with the government. Pharmacy is represented by what's called the Guild of Pharmacy Owners, and there are several people who are designated as a negotiating team, and these guys face off with the economists and the negotiators of the federal government to decide on what is going to be the scope of services, the depth of services, the reimbursement level, all these kinds of things. If anybody's interested in this, you can either go on the web and you can get a copy, or you could borrow mine. But virtually everything's sort of articulated. And then what's articulated as well is what the reimbursement levels are for all these various things. So you hear 6th pharmacy agreement everywhere, because that runs your life. And as I said, politically, the challenge now is how do we move into the 7th pharmacy agreement that is going to expand services, is going to provide a level and depth of services that obviously the population will feel good about, because politically the pharmacies have to be well accepted by the local community. So the elements, and I won't go through all of these things, but this particular one is, as I said, it's a 5-year agreement. There's about 18.8 billion Australian dollars. If you want to do the quick math, $1 US equals $1.35 Australia. So divide by 1.35 and you'll come to, but this is a lot of money. It's a lot of money for 24 million people. I think American pharmacists would gloat if they had this kind of money directed to reimbursement. It's an increase of about 3.2 billion over the 5th agreement, which also is substantial because, most countries are dealing with financial challenges and they're just not going to give people any more. But I think some of the new services, for example, home visitations, was something that the government really wanted. And that's particularly important for the elderly population, to be able to go into the home of the patient, go through the medicine cabinet, take a look at the prescriptions that the doctor has prescribed, figure out with that patient, how they're going to adhere to the therapy, all these kinds of things, which most elderly people, I had to do it with my parents, and I think some of you had to do the same thing. It's a huge challenge. The average elderly person takes 9 medicines. So to get that sorted out and to have them take it at the right time and to sort of watch for interactions or falls or whatever, this is huge. So smartly, the Australians said, we can do this. And so they've set this home, they call it Home Medicines Review. And I think they get paid $60 for doing a home medicines review. They claim to save the government about $3.7 billion by doing these kinds of services. So that was the trade-off for getting the new money. They essentially generated it themselves. They have a dispensing fee. They have some dispensing incentive funding, which really is around moving to generics and higher volume and these kinds of things. Several community pharmacy programs that they term evidence-based, patient-focused on adherence and medication management. Also culturally relevant programs for Aboriginal and Torres Straits patients. If you think about your geography, the Torres Straits are between the northern part of Australia and the Indonesian islands. And the Torres Straits Islands are property of Australia, and the native people there are part of their minority population, have special programs. There's special remuneration programs to wholesalers. And again, I won't go through all these other things. I think you get the drift. Community pharmacy operates at the behest of the population through the government, gets a fixed rate of money. That's what their reimbursement is for the 5-year period. And everybody seems to be pretty happy. Patients are happy, government's happy, pharmacists mostly are happy. You know, they never have enough. If you know any community pharmacy owners, you know there's never enough, right? The reimbursement is never high enough. Well, as I said, there is a structure where payment for drug products also has a copay, and I thought this is fairly high, actually. Every time you get a prescription filled, you have to pay 38 Australian dollars as a copay. It's fairly high. And then payment for professional services. There is a government task force that's looking at pharmacy remuneration in the context of service, and again, it's sort of a political thing. There are some people in the Australian government who feel that the Australian government is putting way too much money into this pharmacy contract. They'd like to see it cut back. So the answer of the Premier is, well, we'll have a study group. So a guy by the name of King from the Parliament is chairing this. But I was told by the insiders that that's just a way to sort of divert from the issue, and you know it'll continue on. It's not going anywhere. But as you see in some of their documents, and I took this quote out of one of the government documents, says, an important opportunity to strengthen the role of community pharmacy and pharmacists in the delivery of primary health care, both now and in the future. So they're working now at defining primary care services. So in addition to doing the therapy management and patient management of medicines, you know, can they do other primary care things like immunization, you know, body and weight measurement of children, all these kinds of things that they typically historically have not done. Now, what's interesting, as I said, this is challenging Australian pharmacy because of the skill levels that are required to provide this extensive series of new services. And what the Society of Hospital Pharmacists in Australia have said is we cannot have all comers eligible for this reimbursement because they're not all going to be competent. And they have been very strong on supporting specialization and moving to board examinations, that kind of thing. Whereas the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia says, no, thank you very much. Everybody's competent to do this. And I have to say, when I was CEO of ASHP, I had the same discussions with APHA. When we first began to talk about Part D reimbursement, and we talked about qualifications that would be required to get reimbursement for professional services under Part D, APHA took the position that's got to be all comers. And we said, no, you have to have special competence to be able to work with elderly. You have to have special competence clinically to be able to manage these patients. And it's not something that you can take a student right out of school and put them into those situations. So they're going through that argument right now. And there is a consumer organization called the Consumer Health Forum, and I picked up one of the things from the website, and they said pharmacy reforms are needed. Deregulation of location and ownership rules. So now pharmacists have to own pharmacies, and they have location requirements, so you just can't pop one up where you want, like we do in the United States. You know, when I go to Florida, there's a pharmacy on every corner. So changing ownership rules governing the whereabouts of pharmacies and who can own them. And it'll be interesting to see where that tension goes. They are talking about advanced practice. It's in its infancy, not very well developed. Australians are the highest users of the Board of Pharmaceutical Specialty. So you take a look at the BPS data showing foreign country, Egypt and Australia are the biggest users of BPS credentialing. Their accreditation council, which is called the Australian Pharmacy Council, had operated a credentialing program, but what you find in credential program, they're very labor intensive, extremely expensive, and so they've eliminated it, so they're kind of back to square one. But hospital pharmacists and the PSA have come to some agreement to support credentialing for advanced practice. But I think the political push to get this done and conditions of participation that would tie to advanced credentialing are going to be embedded, I'm sure, in these service contracts at some point. So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about collaboration, because out of my visit, we came up with a number of recommendations. I came up with a number of recommendations. And one of those is that they should develop a collaboration with UIC. I think culturally, there's a lot of unanimity in thought about the future of the profession. I think they realize where they need to do some major change and improvements in their programs. So for those of you who want to do collaborative research, I think that's an open agenda. Certainly, pharmacy education process and outcomes, this is a huge issue for those of you who are interested in this area. The strengthening and evolution development of clinical education and practice, the whole issue of advanced practice, credentialing and privileging, hospital pharmacy. I would say their logistics and drug management is really good, other than this example that I gave you in pediatric intensive care, but they need a lot of clinical development. They're just beginning to plan residency programs. That's just starting. And then for those of you on the faculty, they would love to have others come and spend a month there and do kind of what I do. There's a grant program that you can compete for. It's $10,000, pays all your transportation and housing and incidentals, and you can spend a month among the Aussies. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of sort of cross-cultural insight and give you some feeling where, with regard to professional reimbursement for services, I think the Australians are really making good progress. It's something that I think we're sort of lapping yet. In some areas, we're getting reimbursed for professional services. Yesterday's CMS announcement was interesting, that CMS is saying we need to use pharmacists more for primary care and more clinically oriented services. Now, they didn't say, and we'll tie it to the reimbursement schedule. But nonetheless, you know, we're working on provider status, and it'll come at some point. So, well, thanks for your attention. I appreciate it.